It is our pleasure to welcome you all today to read. I know you've been welcomed many times. We're delighted to see you here. And to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the READ classroom and the READ curriculum. I am Mary Ashburn Miller. I am the director of our Center for Teaching and Learning. I'm also a professor of history, and I teach in our humanities program. And I'm pretty sure I have the best job on campus, because I both get to teach your students and work with your students, and I also get to learn constantly from my peers and my colleagues. What the Center for Teaching and Learning does is it attempts to provide spaces for conversation and collaboration to help us all be the best professors we can be for your students. And so that means I get to spend pretty much every day hearing about the remarkable things that my colleagues are up to. And so it's my pleasure today to have brought together this panel of esteemed faculty who are here to talk with you all a little bit about what they do in the classroom and hopefully to answer your questions about what your students are about to embark on. So I'll just begin today by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves, name, department, pronouns if you choose, and then also just to share one thing that you value about the READ classroom.
I'm Peter Cassander. I am in the theater department. I teach stage design, stage technology, contemporary performance. I use he, him pronouns. One thing I value most, not the thing I value most, is that when it's working right, I don't have to do a lot. Like when the classroom is humming, when the thing works, it's like being a party host. You've set up the good conditions. You've put the right music on. You've got the light right. It's good. You throw a couple questions into the air, and the conversation takes itself. And it may end up in a different place. It may not be the place you expected in your notes to end up that day, but the conversation is always fierce. It's always exciting, and the students have it among themselves, and that's really, really exciting and inspiring.
My name is Jennifer Corpus. I teach in the psychology department. This will be my 23rd year at READ. I use she, her pronouns. I do developmental and educational psychology, and I'm part of the team that teaches Psych 101, which perhaps many of your students will be taking this fall. In terms of what I value about the READ community, READ classroom, to me, is the sense of community, both intellectual community and just sort of interpersonal community in the sense that we normally think of the word. And the hum that Peter speaks about, I guess I was thinking about it in a slightly different way, but that is what happens when we establish this strong community. It's just an intellectually exciting place to be with a community of learners all supporting one another.
Hi everyone, my name is Kritish Raj Bhandari. I am a faculty member in the English department, and I also teach in the Hum 110 program. And one thing I value the most about READ Classroom is how unique each class is and how unique each student is, which makes teaching more challenging and also more exciting. So I have taught Hum 110 for a few years now, and each time I teach it, it's different. Each conference is different. Each discussion, even if the discussion is of the same text, it's different. I learn something new from each class every time, and that's the thing that I enjoy the most and I value the most about teaching at READ.
Thanks you all so much. I now have a question for this group, and then after that, we'll just open up the floor to you all. And if for some reason you don't have questions, I have a whole bunch more because I'm always eager to learn. I share these panelists' enthusiasm for the hum. I think that was a really nice way of phrasing what can happen sometimes. And also this idea that Kritish raises of each class being different and created in part, right, by the students who are there, which means that whether you've been here for 4 years or for 23, it is each day does feel new and exciting and exhilarating. Someone once described watching us teach as watching like a tightrope performance, right? Like there is something I think really thrilling actually about the work that we get to do in the classroom. So with that in mind, what I would love to hear from the panelists is a little bit about the approaches that they're taking this year to cultivating an inclusive and rigorous classroom environment. And this question comes out of the fact that for what feels like many years, we have been feeling like we're living in unprecedented times for any number of reasons. This group has seen us go through COVID. In many ways, we are still living through it in certain respects. I think all of us have taught on Zoom at some point in the last couple of years. And now, of course, we're facing all kinds of other questions and issues, including artificial intelligence, the emergence of sort of various global crises. And at the same time, there is something about our work, right, that sustains us and that helps cultivate this sense of community that Jennifer was pointing towards. So my question for you all is simply, or not at all simply, this. What do you all see as some of the key challenges, but also opportunities of teaching in this moment? And what will you be doing to foster inclusive and rigorous intellectual engagement in your classrooms this year? It's nice to ask the question and not have to answer it. Peter, do you want to go first?
No, but I'll try. Key challenges. So I teach in the theater department. What we do is about time and space and in being in a room together. We spent a long time not being able to be in rooms together. And that's been really hard, and we're just recovering as a department from this. And so our classroom is not always a traditional classroom. So for us, the stage is a place where is a classroom for us. We teach through practice of our field. And so the making of theater is part of the work. And so we're still learning. One of the challenges is still recovering from the pandemic. Do we get into a room together? Do we work unmasked in rehearsals? How do we operate to make sure that we're making the best work we can, learning as much as we can, and staying safe? This is a big challenge, and we're still facing it. Theater was sort of the first thing to shut down, and it's being the last thing to reopen in the world. And so while other places people have sort of sorted these things, we're still having some of these questions come up for us. So that's a big challenge that we as a department, we as a field are still encountering. An opportunity that goes with that, though, is here we are back in the room, and we're excited. People are hungry to explore these things again, to encounter them, to encounter space and time in this way. And how do we shape it? How do we make it happen? We have lived in, right, we made Zoom theater for a while. It was not great. We did the best we could. We made some amazing things, but it was because it was the only way we could engage with it. But we learned a lot from that, and now we're taking it back into the live environment. So it's exciting to see now what we will make from that time. Can I pass it?
Yeah.
Great.
We could
pass.
I think there are a number of things that came to mind with respect to this question, but I think one thing relates to the increasing awareness of learning differences in the classroom. So we're seeing many, many more diagnoses, many more accommodation plans in recent years, and that's great because that means that students are now getting what they need to have an equitable learning experience. And I think as faculty, this invites us to think more toward universal design in our classrooms. So there are certain practices we can shift to that benefit a wide variety of students and actually can be helpful for many different types of students. We don't necessarily need to keep doing things the way we've always been doing them. There may be ways that we can really maintain the rigor of the curriculum or even increase it in certain ways while removing barriers that don't need to be there. So there are lots of examples of this. A couple that come to mind in terms of how we've shifted practices or things I'm doing in my classroom. As part of the intro psych teaching team, we used to have your typical high stakes assessments as part of the package of the course, and we've really shifted away from that. Now we do these weekly mastery-based quizzes, so that is to say students get multiple attempts to show their best work on those quizzes. They get different questions each time, so it's it's set up in a way where it's very hard for them to game the system. But it turns out that there's a lot of research in cognitive psychology now showing that we learn through testing. Even when we're tested and we get the answers wrong, it actually helps us think through the concepts more deeply and ultimately understand them better. So we're shifting testing practices in a way that's actually benefiting students' learning, and then also removes that for some students for whom there may be a lot of anxiety around timed assessments, around closed book assessments, around high stakes one-shot deals, right? So we're getting, I think, a more authentic sense of what they're learning, and then also actually promoting learning in the process. And that feels like a really positive shift. Another kind of small scale example is just offering multiple different routes for students to show authentic learning. So one thing that I value in my classes, and I think probably we do in a lot of classes, is students showing that kind of day-to-day engagement with the material. So keeping up with the readings, reading deeply, coming to class with ideas, with comments, with questions, with interesting insights, with ideas about how they're integrating across different topics, et cetera. So we like to see that on an ongoing basis, not just for 3 papers throughout the semester. And often at Reed, that's shown through verbal contributions to our conferences. Like that conversation is really critical. At the same time, that's actually not the way that all students learn optimally. So some students prefer to really listen carefully to the conversation, and then they might be able to offer a really powerful insight at the end that kind of weaves comments together, or they might pose really important questions, or they might stay quiet, and then it's in a different way that their learning comes out. So because all of that is so important, some students want to show their expertise or their knowledge or their thinking or their processing through verbal contributions. For other students, a written journal reflection might be a better way for them to process that. For other students, maybe smaller group work where they're playing off one another may be a better way for them to process that information. So I try to build in these different opportunities for students to show engagement. And the end result there, I think each student gets a way that's going to promote their learning to the greatest extent, but the quality of the contributions is just better overall, because there's not everybody fighting for airspace to say something that they think is going to be graded, right? People are bringing really meaningful things to the conversation, and other people are bringing them in, maybe to me in advance in a written form, et cetera. So I think just thinking creatively about how we can cover the content, keep the rigor, and really meet a wide variety of student needs is a challenge and an exciting opportunity of the time.
So I started teaching at Reed in 2019, the fall of 2019. So my entire teaching career at Reed has been kind of dealing through one crisis after another. And what these crises have made more apparent are kind of these deep divisions and inequalities in society. And it has also made me realize more and more that Reed and our classrooms are not a bubble, that we tend to think of classrooms as this enclosed, safe space of learning where, especially at Reed conferences, which are modeled as a democratic exercise and discussion, we tend to think of it as shielded from the outside world. But I've become increasingly, I've increasingly realized that this is not the case, right? Just as heat and smoke from the outside creep into our classrooms in the same way as our racial biases and systemic inequities kind of that are embedded in our institutions and societies are also present in our classroom. So a major challenge for me is how to create an equitable classroom, an inclusive classroom, if the society we are in and the institutions are themselves deeply inequitable, right? And I think this also presents an opportunity because a Reed classroom can become a space, can provide a space where we can address these in a smaller scale, right? When students come to the classroom, they don't leave behind their identities and experiences, right? They bring it with them just as they bring in their abilities, their strengths, and their needs. And as I said earlier, each student is unique and different, and that is what makes Reed Classroom a truly kind of exciting and vibrant space where students bring in, there is a diversity of ideas and experiences and identities. So for me, it is important to embrace those differences, and it's important to build connections and understanding across those differences. And so for me, a safe and inclusive environment can only be built through those kind of connections, through trust and understanding among students. So Jennifer was talking earlier about building a community, right? So that is an important part of Read Classroom, that students should be able to rely on each other, trust each other, in case, right, even if they make a mistake or even when they stumble, they can count on each other. And building community can be difficult, but it can start with simple things like I want to make sure that students know each other by names. Read classrooms are really small, so we have about 20, at the most 24 students, and so that makes it easier for students to get to know each other and become friends over the course of the semester. I often do a lot of collaborative exercises where students have to work together, whether in small groups or pairs, and sometimes in the classroom or outside. Even certain assignments like writing, which is usually done, it's an individual exercise. I have students do brainstorming for their papers in groups or writing in pairs, for example. And I myself, I try to get to know the students individually and get regular feedback from students so that I can adapt my teaching to their needs instead of trying to have them adapt to how I teach. And in that way, teaching and learning becomes kind of a two-way activity so that the students are learning from me and from each other, and I'm also learning from students on how to teach them better.
Thanks so much. And I think, to me, what these comments are really illustrative of are two big things. The first is that one of the things I really marvel at our faculty is their own willingness to adapt and experiment, and through that to grow and develop. And I think, I love, Peter, that you mentioned how much we've learned, right, over the course of these last few years. I would dare to say that your students are facing a stronger faculty and should have better classroom experiences than students who arrived 4 or 5 years ago, not only because Kritish has joined the faculty since then, but also because of all of the ways that we've grown and developed since then. And alongside that is, I think, each one of these really focused on the ways in which we do strive to meet our students where they are, and to build from that and to really try to support the development of a true classroom community. And so I really value that sort of through line in all of these. I'll open the floor for questions now, unless any of you have anything you want to respond to from each other's comments. There's some mics going around.
Thank you. You were talking about, Ms. Jennifer, Dr. Jennifer, about exams or tests being very, very regular and short, and an assessment for learning and contributing to the students as a pedagogical tool. Can you also talk a little bit how that philosophy interacts with the junior qualifying exams that all of the students entering now are going to have to do in several years, please?
Okay. So I just want to make sure I heard the question correctly. So the idea is so we spoke about using exams as a pedagogical tool, but how does that play out with something like a junior qualifying exam? Or
non-stressful exams that happen all the time and are little, but the quality are much bigger?
Right. I'll say a quick thing about that. So In every department, the qual has slightly different form. So I'll speak to how it works within psychology, and then maybe you all can build on that. But I think the kind of the philosophy behind what I'm saying is pretty similar across departments. So our qualifying exam in psychology, students basically have to critique a piece of research and then develop a follow-up research plan that would flow logically from it. And there's lots of components to it where they have to show certain skills. We are working on students developing those skills from intro psych on through the rest of it. So although the assessments in intro psych are not high stakes, we're constantly hitting independent variables and dependent variables. We're hitting, confounds in the experimental design. We're asking them to think about external validity. Is this representative of the broader population? So we're having them think about these things. And many of us, I think actually in almost all my courses, students actually do an assignment that's very similar to the qualifying exam. So they will critique a piece of research, they'll get feedback on it, et cetera. And then in class, we're doing things. As a department, we meet every year and try to identify points of common weakness, I'm going to say, across the qualifying exam. So we're seeing a lot of our students are struggling with X or Y. And so then we'll all sort of commit to ramping that up in our courses for the year. So I think a lot of departments have systems like this or programs. And in fact, we're asked to explicitly think about this. How are we hitting those skills as they get to that point? And I think there is some diversity across departments, but I know that in psychology, and I think in many departments, it is an official rule of the college that we must have a qualifying exam. I think we try to think about it as an educational opportunity and a learning opportunity rather than a barrier. So we sometimes will have students who don't seem quite ready on the qualifying exam, and then we might build in some sort of experience for them over the summer, working with a tutor. We might identify a set of skills that they're really struggling with, and we find a group on campus. We have a lot of support groups, academic support services that we connect them with so that they then are ready to retake that exam right before their senior year, pass it, and move into the thesis. So I think that kind of speaks to Mary's point about meeting students where they are, that although it's this thing that everybody has to pass, it's definitely not thought of as this weeding out mechanism, because I think that feels really, they've dedicated 2 to 3 years of this institution. That would just to me feel out of step with what we value to then decide, sorry, you can't move forward.
Yes, agreed. So in theater we talk about it as a diagnostic and not a gate. Right. That this is what you said basically, but it's not again a tool to like say no, we don't want to have this many thesis students. No, we want as many students as we want, as we can have in our department. And so it's really about where are the students? What are they ready for? What kind of project might they undertake in their senior year? What are they ready to do? That's how we think about the qual. In our department, it is currently, we're changing it again. We change it regularly because we're trying to find the right form to meet the students, again, where they're at. What do they need? What is the right way to evaluate them in this moment? So we have, for example, we've now changed it. Our junior qual will be connected to our junior seminar. And so they will take a class whereby we will talk them through how to do the research methods in our field. What are the unique skills you need to talk about writing skills you need for talking about theater. And so they will do the qual as part of that class. It will be then read by the whole faculty in the department and then talked about from there. But that part of it will happen in a space where they're learning those tools. I can also talk about comp sci for a second. They're a qual. I'm a super advisor for the computer science department. So I hang out, some of my advisees are computer science students. They have specific classes that they say only the material in the qual will come from these classes, and it's up front. You know that ahead of time. So you'll know if you've seen the material that will be on the qual. Right? That's a different way, a different department deals with the same question.
Yeah. We have another question back here, and then there's a couple up front after this one. Yeah.
Hello. I was wondering if you could speak to how Reed's academic requirements reflect the school's values and beliefs about what all students should do and learn about. And also, part 2 of the question, if you could indulge me as well, is how do you expose students to curricula that they might not be otherwise exposed to and learn about, have the chance, the interest to learn about in the non-required courses. If a student hadn't considered taking a psychology course before, how did they, perhaps become interested?
I'll set a very big picture and then we'll hand it over. So I think, one thing that I like to just sort of name and identify is this path that all of our students take from this truly collective experience of Hume 110 to the much more individualized experience of the thesis. And I think that is one really important reflection of some underlying core beliefs of what we do here. The first is that learning is collaborative and that we start with collaboration and we have to have that first in many ways before we can go off kind of on our own to do that independent research. I will also say that research is also deeply collaborative. And so I would say they look really different, but both of them reflect this idea that has come up repeatedly today, which is that learning happens in community and through these kinds of collaborations. So I think that's one way of thinking about that big arc of the work here. I don't know if you all might want to talk a little bit about how we might think about how group requirements fit into that as well. In particular, this idea of gaining exposure. All of us are about to advise your students, and I know we often hear I'm not a math student, but I have to do X or Y or Z. So how do you all think about, reaching students who maybe have not been exposed to your discipline before through these group requirements?
I think that often happens through the introductory level classes, at least in English. So the 200 level courses are open to all students regardless of their majors, and these courses introduce students to literature. They teach students how to appreciate literature, how to read literature, and often students who think themselves as more science oriented come to these classes and then realize that they really enjoy reading, analyzing poetry or reading fiction, and sometimes they end up even changing their majors. And so that happens quite often, and it happens both ways, right? So these courses, through these courses, students get exposure outside of their majors, and the READS group structure, where students are required to take certain number of humanities courses outside of Hume 110. So Hume 110 is a required course for everyone, and outside of that, they need to take additional 2 or 3 courses in the humanities, and that I think ensures that students are exposed to different disciplines.
I mean, I'm not sure how much nuts and bolts stuff you all have gotten, right? But just in brief, students basically need to take Hume 110. They need to take 2 to 3 courses, basically 3 courses in the humanities in addition to that, 3 courses in the social sciences, broadly speaking, in addition to that, and then 3 courses in natural sciences and mathematics in addition to that. So that ensures that they're getting some breadth. In addition, a lot of departments have minors as well as majors. So some students may choose they have their major area that they're digging deep in, and then they may also go into depth in one of these other areas. There are also several departments, psychology does, and I know linguistics does, and maybe you all know of others, that have something called an allied field. So in psychology, there's the 11 units you do in the major, and then all students are required to complete an allied field. And that's not in a specific discipline or major, it's in an area. So they might do an allied field in cognitive sciences and take 6 courses in anthro and computer science and linguistics and biology. Or they might do an allied field in history and social sciences and do soc and anthro and poli-sci or something like that. So I think each department also has ways of encouraging students to expose themselves to other areas in sort of a systematic way, in addition to kind of these exploration opportunities. Like Kritish talked about the 200 level courses in English. Many departments have these. We have several in psychology. They're open to all majors. One does not need to have taken the intro class. And we, I think this is common, we hold about 25% of the seats for first year students every year as well, to ensure that there's going to be opportunities for students from the very beginning at Reed to just sort of sample in these different areas.
Yeah, our department has a fairly flat structure to it. How the classes in each department operate are different. I think ours is pretty flat. Yours is really, really flat. In that there aren't prerequisites. So theater, there's many different entry points. People enter through acting or design or through literature or all kinds of different ways. And so, no, there's no, like, you have to take intro to theater before you can take an advanced course. No, where you want to enter, you enter. And then you can explore from there. And if you are a major, you're required to explore all those areas. We're not a conservatory, right? This is a liberal arts. We talk about in our theater department, we're not a conservatory. We are a liberal arts program within a liberal arts college. The expectation is you're going to explore across the board and bring in ideas from all over the place.
Yeah.
I think,
Sorry. Go ahead.
To not present an overly idyllic picture, right? There are some majors that have pretty heavy requirements, and students need to start right away, and they have fewer degrees of freedom, right? So if you're a biochem molecular biology major, for example, if you're a neuroscience major, you still have to meet all those broad group requirements, but beyond that, there's not as much room to sample. So it may depend a little bit on the course that your student is planning.
And Jennifer mentioned allied fields. There are also several different interdisciplinary programs and interdisciplinary majors, and they are also increasing because more and more students nowadays are interested in working across different disciplines. So there's a program called Comparative Race and Ethnicity Studies for students who are interested in studying race and ethnicity. There's one in Film and Media Studies, which was just Film and Media Studies major, which was just introduced last year. There's also a Comparative Literature program, and I think those are some.
Environmental science.
Environmental science is another one as well. Yeah.
I know we have two questions up here, and while the microphone is getting there, I'll just sort of, the original question was about values, and so I think one thing I did just want to pull out here is that I think one of the values underpinning these requirements is the idea that we are not producing people who can only talk to people who have studied exactly what they have, right? So that our hope is that a Reed graduate will be able to engage with you deeply, whether you are a historian, a theater performer or practitioner, a literature scholar, a banker, a lawyer, an activist, whatever, right? And that the thesis board reflects that. So all of your students will one day defend a thesis, and there will be one or two people from outside of their field who will be there evaluating that with them. And I think that that's a really important value. Okay, sorry. I know you've been waiting a long time.
Thank you. Since when a student turns in a paper, they're not given a grade, a letter grade, can you tell me what feedback might look like on a paper? And then if you present as a professor opportunities for improvement or for deeper thought, how does a student follow up on that and incorporate some of the ideas that you may have?
Yeah, I can start to answer that. So usually whenever after students turn in their papers, I return the paper to my students with detailed comments, written comments. So it might be several paragraphs long where I point to some of the things that they did well in their essays and some of the things that needs improvement. And I point to directions on how to improve them. And I also often, in the initial beginning part of the semester, for example, for the first paper, I present an opportunity for them to revise maybe one paragraph by kind of taking into consideration my feedback. And so I would kind of go over those revisions with them. In Hume 110, every paper is followed by a paper conference in which the professor meets individually with the students for about half an hour, going over the comments and going over the papers. And so what that allows us to do is kind of track the progress over the course of the year on how their writing is improving. And that also allows us to work incrementally, so that I don't point out all the mistakes that they're making in their first paper. So I kind of start with the basics and point out a few things that they need to change. And that makes it more manageable to the students as they are working on their writing. And often it's very fulfilling to see like how their writings have changed, by the end of the year. So that's, I think, the general process in Hum 110. And in majority of humanities classes, students receive their papers with long written comments.
Hello.
I was just going to add that we also, I think maybe in the sciences and in psychology, you might get more structured feedback. So I might have a sheet that lays everything out. Did they summarize the hypothesis accurately? Did they state the variables that were measured and critique their validity? Did they do this? And so the students see those things, and under each of those categories, I'll give comments. Or sometimes it'll be open-ended, paragraphs, or sometimes, usually students will submit their papers like in Microsoft Word, and I'll just use track changes and throughout show those sorts of comments. One other thing, I think many of us have assignments that are built in stages so that students they're working on a big research project. First, they're going to turn in a topic proposal. Then they're going to turn in an annotated bibliography, and I'm going to give feedback on that. Then they're going to turn in a sketch of their research design. They get feedback on that. Then they take all of that and do a verbal presentation. They get feedback on that. Then they finally put it into the APA style paper. So some assignments are broken down into these components so that feedback is built into it.
Hi, thank you. Reed College's curriculum is sort of famously or infamously rigorous, and I know that in my own experience, my classmates and I, going through school years ago, didn't really get taught how to sort of take care of ourselves very well, or to manage time and sort of a workload. We sort of had to learn that organically, and if you had a professor or TA or something that would share things, that would be helpful. You got lucky. I was curious to hear from the panelists, what do you think Reed College does well in terms of helping students learn how they learn and take care of themselves, and what you think could be sort of improved upon or done better at the college?
Do I want to go?
I can kind of get us started. So the question is about how we support students learning how to learn, as well as how to take care of themselves, and what we're good at and where we could use a little bit of progress and growth. I think I think probably each one of us will have a different answer for how we support this. I mean, I can certainly speak from the perspective of Hum 110, which I think is a really important place where this kind of learning happens. And I think one thing that when I have taught in Hum 110 before, have tried to do is to make clear kind of what the norms are inside of the classroom, especially surrounding things like participation. I will say, I came to college from a school that was very authoritarian. I did not have a voice in that school at all. Walking into a classroom like Reed would have been very alienating to me. And so I draw on that experience and really try to support the students in learning how to be participants in conference, rather than assuming that they all come in kind of knowing that skill. Likewise, before the first paper in Hum 110, we'll sit down as a class and we'll talk about what we saw in the readings. We'll walk through a kind of brainstorming exercise to support the creation of that first paper. I never want anyone to come into any assignment feeling like they did not learn in my class how to take the steps necessary to achieve success on that. I'll pause there and see if anybody else wants to add anything.
I'll just add to what Mary has already said. I work all the skills incrementally, so I don't assume that just because a student has come to read and is in the Hum 110 classroom, they already know how to write and how to talk and discuss their ideas in conference, because usually the transition from high school to college there's a big gap, and so I build in different exercises and activities throughout the semester and the year, so that the students, I structure the discussions towards the beginning of the year, and I slowly draw back on those structures by the end of the year. And usually what happens is that by the second semester, students are more confident and more able to kind of have the discussions on their own without me having to facilitate or structure them. So so it's usually, I do it step by step and work on it more as a transition.
I have a couple other thoughts. Often students just need a model. They don't, they've learned this material and then they're asked to integrate it in this way, and they don't even understand what that would look like. So for almost every assignment, I'll have a few examples from previous students on some analogous topic or something, so they can just see what a product might look like. In addition, Reed does have several sort of at the more structural level supports for students, right? So we have a writing center, we have tutoring in each of the STEM subjects. We have tutoring that they can access for any class. And whenever I talk to students, especially incoming students, I try to emphasize that in any given semester, about 50% of the student population is accessing tutoring services. So it's very normative here. Some people may have come from a high school environment where that was stigmatized or it was for a certain set of students. It's really for everybody. And so I try to normalize that as much as possible because it's tough. It is tough here at times, and it's very appropriate to reach out to support resources. We also have, I'm forgetting the name of it, but like a coaching program. What is it?
Yeah, academic coaching, yeah.
Yeah, so some students are not necessarily having conceptual difficulties, but they're having trouble with maybe sort of executive function type things, like organizing their time or organizing an argument. And so they can get free help from an academic coach who can help walk them through that. And so I think the academic advisors are aware of that. And when I see that as sort of cropping up in students' work, I'll recommend that they do that. So I think it's a lot of faculty trying to encourage students to be aware of and to use resources that we have on campus, which I think can be tremendously helpful, at least as the students have reported back to me.
We're actually almost out of time, so I don't know.
One more.
Can we do one more? I know you've had your hand up for a bit. And I'll say I will be able to stick around for a little bit after the close of the session for people that have lingering questions. Yeah.
Hi. I come in from a place where I didn't really know anything about the Reed curriculum. I went to a school with an open curriculum. So I was wondering if you could, as quickly as possible, not to waste anybody's time, walk me through what the requirements are for graduation, and how it kind of tracks year by year. Like you were talking about qualifying exams, but junior year came up, but I thought, are they at the end of sophomore year when you would declare a major?
Wait, when is it?
And, just like, I know it sounds like you have, requirements for, do you have a foreign language requirement? Do you have, 3 classes in each discipline, like you were kind of talking about at the beginning? Just any kind of clear, I just don't know. And I'm hoping that other
I can
people
do it
maybe
fast.
don't.
So the whole degree is 30 units. So 7.5 units a year is smooth sailing the whole way through. Each class is usually 1 unit. So that's just one way to think about it. Hume 110 is 1.5 units, so it's 3 in the first year. It takes up a lot of the schedule during the first year. What we think of as normal enrollment is 3 or 4 units per semester. 5 is an overload. Under 3 is a underload. Did I say that right? Yes. Okay. Most department majors are between 9 and 12 units to complete the major. Most minors are between 5 and 7 units of that time, and they can overlap everything else. There are 3 group requirements, these 3 groups of 3, in each area. You need 2 units in one department and 1 unit in a second department inside each of those groups. Your home department can count for 2 of those units. So That's part of how the structure works. You also need 6 PE and community engagement enrollments over the course. They're quarter length, so you can do 4 in a year, but you need 6 to graduate. And those are outside of the other counts. So there's like 2 sets of numbers you're adding up to. Thesis is 2 of those units, 2 of those 30 when you get to the end of it. I think that's the short version.
And the junior qualifying exam happens during junior year at some point.
Yeah, so you have to take a qualifying exam in your junior year to qualify for thesis, to say that you are ready to undertake thesis work. And it happens during the junior year with some exceptions depending on department. There's a lot of flexibility around that. Students don't declare a major until the end of the second year, usually. Mm-hmm. So you get about halfway done, 15 units in, and you then have to declare a major and have an advisor in your home department, et cetera, et cetera.
We are out of time, and I know that there's other things on your calendars, so please just join me in thanking our panelists here. And thanks to all of you for entrusting us with your students. We're looking forward to working with them. I'll be here with additional answers if you all have questions.